The winter Evan lost his job, the sky over Cleveland seemed permanently the color of old steel. He used to wake before dawn, lace his boots, and drive across the river to the plant where the furnaces hummed like a living thing. When the gates closed for good, he sat in his truck for an hour, hands on the wheel, watching men he'd known for years walk out with cardboard boxes and faces emptied of sound. At home, the house felt too quiet. His wife, Mara, tried to keep routines intact for their 8-year-old daughter Lily, but grief has a way of leaking into the corners of a day. Bills stacked on the counter. The fridge hummed louder. The dog aged faster. Evan filled out applications at the library, learning the smell of dust and old paper as if it were a new trade. Weeks turned into months. He took temporary shifts when he could, hauling drywall, shoveling snow for neighbors, delivering groceries in his own truck until the transmission groaned. Pride became a thing he folded small and put away. At night, he lay awake listening to the house settle, wondering how a life could tilt so quietly and still feel like a fall. Across town, Grace Alvarez opened her thrift store every morning at 9. The bell above the door chimed with the optimism of a promise, even on days when no one came. The shop was a narrow rectangle, walls crowded with coats and dresses, shelves lined with chipped mugs and picture frames that once held other people's happiness. Grace ran it with her sister until cancer took Rosa 2 summers ago. Now Grace ran it alone, the way she did everything else, with patience learned from long hospital hallways and a stubborn belief that small kindnesses could still make a difference. One afternoon, Evan came in to look for a winter coat for Lily. He moved carefully between racks, embarrassed by the arithmetic of his wallet. Grace noticed his hesitation and the way his eyes kept drifting to the children's section. She asked about size, about favorite colors. She pretended not to see the way his hands shook when he counted out cash. When she rang him up, she slid a knit hat across the counter, sky blue and soft, and said it came with the coat. He tried to refuse. She smiled like it wasn't worth discussing. The hat became Lily's favorite thing. She wore it to school, to bed, even to the grocery store. When Evan returned a week later with a box of old books to donate, Grace thanked him as if he'd brought gold. They talked about the weather, about the Browns, about the strange comfort of routine. Over time, Evan started helping out on Saturdays, fixing a loose shelf, hauling donations, shoveling the sidewalk when snow piled up. Grace never asked why he did it. She paid him in coffee and quiet conversation. The city announced a new job training program that spring, a partnership with a logistics company expanding on the east side. Evan enrolled, studied late, learned software that felt like a foreign language. He passed the tests by a thin margin and got hired. The first paycheck felt unreal in his hands. He brought home groceries without calculating each item. Mara cried in the kitchen, the good kind of crying that cleans the air. On the morning Evan started his new job, a storm rolled in fast and mean. He slid on black ice 2 blocks from Grace's store and clipped a parked car. No one was hurt, but the police report was a brick in his chest. Insurance would cover part of it, but the deductible might as well have been a mountain. He stood on the sidewalk afterward, phone in hand, breath fogging, thinking about how close hope always seemed to breaking. Grace saw him from the doorway. She brought him inside, poured coffee, let him sit without explaining. When he did speak, the words came out jagged. She listened the way Rosa used to. Listen, with her whole body angled toward someone else's pain. Grace didn't offer solutions. She offered time. When Evan left, steadier than he'd arrived, he didn't notice the envelope she tucked into his coat pocket until he was halfway home. Inside was a gift card to a local garage and a note in careful handwriting that said, "We all need a hand sometimes." The envelope felt heavy with more than paper. Evan wanted to give it back. He didn't. He went to work, learned routes, learned names, learned how to be useful again. On Fridays, he brought Lily to the thrift store to help sort donations. Lily made friends with a girl whose mother worked nights. They laughed between racks, inventing stories for the objects they touched. The store filled with noise again. Summer came, loud and green. Grace hosted a sidewalk sale that spilled into the street. Neighbors stopped by, lingered, shared stories. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else brought lemonade. The bell over the door chimed, and Grace felt Rosa close in the way a person feels a memory become a presence. She caught Evan watching Lily laugh, his face open, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of having nudged a life back toward light. The fall after Evan's promotion, when the leaves burned bright and then let go, the logistics company announced layoffs. A smaller cut this time, but fear moved fast. Evan's name wasn't on the list, but it might as well have been, the way anxiety lingered. He took extra shifts, tried to be invisible and indispensable at once. The pressure seeped into his shoulders, into the spaces between his words. At home, Mara noticed the old restlessness return, the nights spent staring at the ceiling. Grace's store struggled that autumn. Online donations slowed. Rent rose. She sold fewer coats than usual. One evening, she closed early and sat on the floor among boxes, hands resting on her knees, letting the grief she'd postponed finally speak. She wondered how long belief could carry her without something solid to lean on. The phone rang. It was Evan, asking if she needed help with anything. She laughed at the timing, wiped her eyes, and said she was fine. He showed up anyway with takeout and a broom. They worked quietly, the way people do when words would complicate something simple. Evan fixed a wobbly table. Grace sorted receipts. The storm outside moved in waves. When they finished, they sat on the floor and ate noodles from cartons, talking about Lily's school play and the best place in town for pie. Grace admitted she might have to close if winter was bad. Evan listened, then said he'd help however he could. Winter was worse than bad. Snow buried the sidewalks. The furnace in the store failed on a Tuesday afternoon, coughing itself into silence. Grace wrapped herself in a coat and waited for the repair estimate like a verdict. The number was more than she had. She locked the door and walked home in the dark, the bell's optimism muted behind her. The next morning, Evan showed up with a borrowed space heater and a plan. He'd talked to coworkers, to neighbors, to people who remembered Rosa and the way she used to set aside coats for anyone who needed one. They organized a community sale, a fundraiser disguised as a party. Word spread faster than Grace expected. On Saturday, the street filled again. Someone fixed the furnace at cost. Someone else brought soup. People bought things they didn't need because they wanted the store to exist. Grace stood behind the counter, hands shaking for a different reason this time. She watched Evan carry boxes, watched Lily help an elderly woman find a scarf. She felt the arc of the last few years bend toward something gentle. When the bell chimed that evening, it sounded like a promise kept. Months later, in early spring, Evan lost his job anyway. The cut finally reached him. He told Mara at the kitchen table, voice steady, hands folded. She took his hands and said they would figure it out. Evan walked to the thrift store in the rain, the envelope from years ago folded thin in his pocket like a talisman. He didn't need to open it to remember what it meant. Grace met him at the door. He didn't have to explain. She made coffee. She listened. When he finished, she asked if he'd like a job. Not charity, she said. Work. She needed someone to manage donations, organize deliveries, build a website. Evan laughed, then cried, then laughed again. It wasn't the job he'd imagined years ago, but it was work that made sense. The store changed. They added an online shop. They partnered with shelters. They hosted weekly dinners. The bell chimed for new reasons. Evan learned code in the evenings, Lily did homework on the counter, Mara volunteered on weekends. Grace watched the place become something bigger than survival. It became a center, a circle. On a clear morning in May, Evan hung a sign in the window announcing a scholarship funded by store proceeds, small but real, for kids in the neighborhood. Grace stood beside him, thinking of Rosa, thinking of the way kindness multiplies when given room. Evan thought of the winter sky like old steel and the way it had finally cracked open. Hope didn't arrive all at once. It came as hats slid across counters, as coffee poured, as hands steadied other hands. It came as loss was met with listening, as fear was met with plans, as people chose each other again and again. The bell chimed. The door opened. The future, imperfect and possible, stepped inside.